Go ahead.
Let's talk about forgiveness for your PPP loans. I'm Ty Kiesel, Director of Content at NAV.
And I'm Jerry Detweiler, Education Director at NAV.
If you get a Paycheck Protection Program loan or a PPP loan, it may be 100% forgivable if you spend the funds the right way in the right period of time. Here, let's talk about a brief overview of how that works. But for more information, we'll link to more detailed articles on the subject in the comments.
For many business owners, it's going to be fairly simple, but the more employees you have, the more complicated it may get. So we're going to hit on the highlights here, but keep in mind, Ty and I are not accountants and we're not attorneys. So this is for educational purposes. We want to help you understand the questions you may want to ask your advisors.
So here's the basic way forgiveness works. You get a PPP loan. During the covered period, which we're going to describe in a few minutes, you spend it on specific items, primarily payroll. You apply for forgiveness with your lender and provide the required documentation. The lender has up to 60 days to respond to your request for forgiveness and ideally agrees that the balance is forgiven. They'll submit it to the SBA for official forgiveness approval, and any balance not forgiven becomes a 1% loan.
Now, here's where it can get a little more complicated. There are currently 3 forgiveness applications. 3508 is the full forgiveness application. That's with all the information about your employees and all your expenditures. Now, there's a simplified form called 3508S, S for simple. That one you're supposed to use if your loan amount is $150,000 or less. The SBA wants you to use that form. And then there's one called 3508EZ that sort of falls in between. It's for loans above $150,000, but where you generally haven't done any major reductions in headcount or wages for your employees. So you're going to have to figure out which application is right for you.
Now, it's really important that you understand forgiveness before you get your loan, because once the funds hit your bank account, the clock starts ticking. You have the covered period to spend those funds. Initially, that was 8 weeks after the loan was dispersed. Then it changed to 8 or 24 weeks. And now you get to choose any number of weeks between 8 and 24 weeks after you receive your PPP funds. Say that 3 times fast. So you'll want to choose carefully to maximize forgiveness.
Now, I wish I could tell you here's exactly what you choose for your covered period, but it is going to be an individual decision based on your circumstances. But let me give you a quick example. Let's say you're self-employed, you have no employees, you don't pay yourself formal payroll, so you're going to qualify for your loan forgiveness based on your net profit instead of your payroll, because you don't really pay payroll. Now, if you choose the 8-week period, you probably can't get full forgiveness just based on your money you pay yourself. You're probably going to need other expenses like rent or utilities to fill in the gap. So if you chose a little bit longer covered period in that circumstance, you probably could qualify just based on the money you pay yourself. So you're going to have to figure out, maybe with the help of your accountant or advisor, what covered period is going to work best for you to maximize forgiveness.
Now, as a general rule, for forgiveness, you need to spend at least 60% of the forgiven amount on payroll and payroll-related expenses. For employees, payroll is based on cash compensation up to $100,000 annually, plus certain eligible payroll expenses like the employer's share of group health insurance, dental insurance, vision, and disability insurance premiums, or the retirement contributions.
The business owner's payroll may be calculated a little differently than your employee's payroll in most cases, because generally you can't include those other expenses that Ty mentioned, your group health, dental, vision, et cetera, in your payroll. But this is all spelled out in the application and the guidance from the SBA. So if you pay attention carefully, it'll walk you through that.
Another thing to keep in mind is that if you have employees, reducing headcount or wages may reduce the amount you get forgiven. There are some exceptions, though. If you have employees who refuse to come back to work, or if your business was unable to operate due to guidance from certain state or federal authorities, for example, these are spelled out in the forgiveness guidelines.
Now, you can spend up to 40% of the forgiven amount on eligible non-payroll expenses. So those are things like business rent, business utilities, mortgage interest. And there are 4 new categories of covered expenses, which include things like covered operations expenditures, like software to track your inventory, or covered worker expenditures, which can include things like PPE for your employees.
Also, it's not all or nothing. If you're running these calculations, you might discover that you get 90% of your loan forgiven. If that happens, the rest becomes a loan with a 1% interest rate, which you can then pay back over 5 years or 2 years for older loans, or just pay the amount back right away. That's still not a bad deal for most businesses. A 1% interest rate on financing for a small business loan is really a good interest rate.
Yeah, and if you get a first and a second PPP loan, and I know many of you are hoping to get that second PPP loan, just keep in mind that you have to spend your proceeds from your first loan before the second loan is dispersed. That shouldn't be a problem for most of you. And you have to file 2 separate forgiveness applications, one for each loan. You can file them simultaneously, and you have to file the first one even if you're going to get 0 of that first loan forgiven.
Now, speaking of the application, even if you qualify for the simplified forgiveness form, you still need to calculate the forgiveness amount and make sure you spend the money in the right way. So it's a good idea to review the application early on so you can better understand how it works. And talk to a financial advisor if you're not sure. Investing that time upfront and even paying for good advice can save you a lot of money in the long run if it helps you get forgiveness.
Yes, absolutely. I recently heard from a business owner who didn't understand that they could pay themselves out of the PPP funds. So they avoided taking any money for their own compensation out of the PPP funds. And then they found out they aren't qualified for full forgiveness. So you definitely don't want to make those kinds of mistakes.
You also need to document how you spend your money during your covered period and keep those records, some for 6 years after the loan is forgiven, because the SBA can come back and audit you to make sure you spent the money in the way that you said you did and that it was used properly. So my advice would be expect to be audited and make sure you keep those records.
Yeah, and we have written several articles that walk you through the applications, including one we just updated that walks through the full application 3508 if you have employees. Now, I want to give you a quick heads up. The way the application is designed is a little confusing. If you just start on the first page and try to work your way down, you're going to find yourself flipping back and forth and trying to find what refers to what. So the way we laid it out in our article is we start with where we think you should start in the middle and do those calculations, which will back into the calculations on page 1. So we've tried to organize it a little easier for you to follow along the way it works. But I wouldn't hesitate to print out that application, read the article, follow along, and find out where your questions are so you can get those questions answered before you start spending that money.
Something else you need to be aware of too is the forgiveness applications and the rules have changed over time with the latest changes coming in the Economic Aid Act. That's the stimulus bill they're talking about right now. So always make sure you're looking at the latest guidance.
Yeah, I do want to point out real quick a couple of really positive changes in the recent legislation. The first is that idle advances or grants are no longer deducted from PPP for forgiveness. So if you got an idle grant or advance in the past, you had to subtract that out of your PPP forgiveness, which essentially turned it into a loan. That's not happening anymore. It's not on the current applications and it's retroactive. Even if you already got your PPP loan forgiven, you should talk to your lender about getting that money forgiven. And then the second is that forgiven PPP loans, they're not taxed, but also the legislation makes clear that if you spend that money on expenses that would normally be tax deductible, you can still deduct those expenses. So that's another piece of good news for business owners, especially going into tax season.
We hope you found this helpful. Remember, this is free money from the government to help your business if you get it forgiven. Don't be afraid to hire a professional to help you if you don't understand it. Think of it as, think of that consultation as a cost of doing business. And if it means more PPP funds are forgiven, it's worth it.
I just want to remind you, you will apply for forgiveness with the lender who gave you your PPP loan. And you can stay up to date with all the latest resources on the NAV blog, nav.com/blog. We'll link to that as well. And if you haven't yet applied for your first or second PPP loan, please take a look at that. NAV can help. I just talked to a business owner this morning who discovered she may qualify for her first PPP loan and her husband may qualify for a second. So just fill out your PPP application at nav.com, get started. Our goal is to help your business get the money it needs to survive and thrive. So we hope you found this helpful and we appreciate you joining us. Let's take a couple of questions that have come in, Ty. Ian, you said, does the second PPP loan apply to 1099 contractors? Absolutely, yes. If you meet the qualifications, you can absolutely apply as a self-employed individual, independent contractor, gig workers. In fact, we did a whole video about that as well. So definitely look into that. And then Hanan is asking, how long does it take to get a decision? Well, here's what's going on right now. There are thousands of PPP loans outstanding, and they all have to go through the SBA. Ty, you want to explain this real quick?
Remember that the SBA has never tackled anything at this scale that I'm aware of before. I mean, this is just absolutely huge for them. And so, your lender's going to make an application with the SBA. It needs to be reviewed by the SBA, and that just takes time. So once you apply, if your lender says we're going to approve you, there's still a couple of more steps that need to go through, and it's just not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, so we are seeing movement. I can tell you that for sure, but be patient with your lender, understand that they want to make these loans too. That's their business, right? They want to make loans. So just be patient with that process. Let's see, we have a question about the 1099 process. Yes, we have an article on how to apply for PPP if you are self-employed. That's on the NAV blog, and we will be sure to include that. We also have an article on how to apply for forgiveness for your PPP loan if you are self-employed. So just as Ty and I mentioned, I would encourage you to read these articles while you're waiting for this decision, right? Read these articles and try to understand what's going to go on with forgiveness so that you can maximize your forgiveness and hopefully get it 100% approved. And Allie, thanks for joining us again today. I'm glad you're finding this helpful. All right, go ahead, Ty.
Once you apply and you learn more, if you decide you don't want the financing, there's nothing saying you have to take it. So during that interim where it's going through the process, learn as much as you can, because once that money is in your bank account, the clock is ticking. You don't have any time to waste. You've got to treat it, you've got to spend it on the right things. You've got to track it as we're recommending. And so, don't worry that you're under the gun if you make an application at the last minute. You say, I don't know if I want this or not.
Yeah, I think you'll find that if you can qualify for either partial or full forgiveness, it's a really good deal. It's like a
Oh, yeah.
grant from the SBA. And Cheryl, yes, the simplified forgiveness form 3508S is in all of our articles. We've linked to that actual form in all those articles. You won't actually turn in that form. The lender will probably have their own online form for it. But what I do want to mention real quick on that simplified form is you still, like I mentioned earlier, you still have to do the calculation. Like even if you're just checking boxes, you still have to know, how did I spend this money? Did I spend it the proper period of time to qualify for forgiveness? So I think you should still look at either the 3508 easy or the full 3508 to back out those calculations to make sure you're doing it right. So if the SBA comes back to you, hopefully they won't, but they could. If they come back to you, you have that documentation. You can say, here's how I spent the money, and here's why I qualified for forgiveness. All right, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue to come back with more videos and more answers to your questions, and we'll continue to answer them in the comments as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.